Well, welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Today we wind up chapter 12 and move on into chapter 13. Chapter 13 is the third of 5 or 6 great lectures, speeches, or discourses that kind of frame the Gospel of Matthew. We've already seen the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7, and then Jesus talking about the cost of discipleship in chapter 10. So chapter 13, he really shifts gears and starts a new kind of teaching that we call parables, short stories about everyday life that have an important spiritual meaning, an important point. And there's an emphasis here on secrecy, on people being able to get it. Whereas before in the book of Matthew, it's all been about proclaiming the kingdom of heaven, proclaiming the message, the good news, getting the word out. We would say broadcasting, trying to make it go viral. But now it seems like he's aiming at a select few. There seems to be a discrimination now between disciples, people that really want it and get it, and the people or the masses, the multitudes who see Jesus as kind of interesting, kind of a diversion, kind of entertaining, but they're not really worried about going on to the next level with him. So at any rate, he starts off chapter 13 with what for most people is a very familiar parable, the parable of the sower. So that's why I brought you back down here, because you may or may not remember it, but last fall I showed the power of the seed. I showed you how we were planting wheat here around a pond that we were kind of renovating on my mother's place. And we talked about the power in the seed, the power in the message. And lo and behold, we planted wheat because it was too late in the year to plant any other kind of grassy vegetation. But look what's happened. The wheat has germinated. The wheat has come up. Now, all the seed didn't come up, but we have a really healthy growth here. We just threw the seed out on the surface of the ground, and so I'm sure the birds and the animals got their share of it, and that's what Jesus said happens. And we've had plenty of moisture so far, so we haven't had any die due to drought, and that's the second kind of seed that goes into soil that's not very fertile. It's just too shallow. It's on top of a rocky ledge. Not very common in Mississippi, but more common in Palestine. And then we also don't have much competition from weeds yet, but that's coming. Believe me, that's coming. When it gets a little bit warmer, a little bit hotter, we'll have all sorts of wild weeds grow up and try to choke this grass out. And then finally, we expect some of this wheat to actually produce fruit, to produce more wheat, to make seeds, to make heads. And so it'll be interesting to see that process move along, just as Jesus said it would. Before we deal with Jesus' further teaching on parables and his explanation of the meaning of the parable of the sower, let's go back to chapter 12. Pick up something that we didn't get to last time. We start in chapter 12 and verse 46. It says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to them, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. This is an astounding passage. I think in almost any culture, the fact that here is this very godly teacher, even non-believers would say a godly teacher, and for believers, the Son of God. And it's not so astounding that he proclaims this level of loyalty to obedient disciples, but the fact that in so doing, he is apparently disrespectful of his own family, particularly his mother, because this is one of the 10 commandments, right? Honor your father and your mother. In fact, if we go over to chapter 15, Jesus really condemns the Pharisees, some of his opponents, because of their lack of care and concern for their elderly parents. So what's going on here? What's this all about? And I think we have to struggle with this a bit. If we look at the other Gospels, they provide a little bit more information here. I believe it's Mark that says that his mother and brothers went to take charge of him because when they heard that he was working so hard that he didn't take time to eat, they decided he was out of his mind, and so they went to get him. And that may have something to do with it. In the book of John, it's clear that his brothers were very skeptical about his being Messiah, about his being Son of God. But they were very skeptical about this claim. However, we get to the book of Acts, and Jesus' mother and brothers appear to be leaders, particularly his brothers, in that early church. And so we would say that they came around. Still, though, this is a bit tough, and I think one way we can reconcile this with what we know about the Bible, about Jesus and his teachings, is he's teaching us that sometimes the kingdom has to take priority, even over the highest priorities we have in this life for our families. And this is made clear in Luke chapter 14, another passage about the cost of discipleship. So I think that he is teaching that by example in his own life in a way that's almost impossible for us to forget. Or he's already said in chapter 10 in Cost of Discipleship, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And so the fact that although Christians are called to a very high standard with regard to care and love for their family members, their husbands, their wives, their parents, their children, then even though they're called to this high standard, there are times when the kingdom exerts a higher level of loyalty, and there needs to be some sort of a priority assigned accordingly. Well, a tough passage there. At any rate, we've already reviewed the content of the parable of the sower, and I think you're probably pretty familiar with Jesus' interpretation. He said, the seed that falls on the hard ground and never has a chance to germinate, the birds come and take it away. And he said, this is the way that with people, some people hear, but it doesn't really penetrate. They're kind of interested in the message, but not really that interested. And so before long, Satan comes and takes the message away, and the seed never really makes much of an impression on them or changes their life. Then there are two other kinds of soil where people are gung-ho about following Jesus. I mean, they are sold out. They're all in favor of it. The first kind are those that are on that shallow soil that we talked about, and when hardships come, as they inevitably do, when trials and tribulations and persecution, when life doesn't go the way we thought it was going to go, then because these people don't have their roots down deep into their relationship with the Father, they wither and die. There's such a change between the cool, rainy, spring-like weather that we're enjoying now and the heat and dry spells that we so oftentimes have in the summer, and much harsher conditions for plants, for people in those hot periods. And then the other kind of enthusiastic early believers are people who they're gung-ho, they're sold out, but they don't know how to say no. They don't know how to set priorities. And so worries and riches and the cares of life literally choke the plants out. And sometimes I think about this as being the Walmartization of new converts, the Walmartization. And it's all the stuff, all the things, all the distractions that we have in life that make it really hard for us to set aside time to go to worship, to go to church. There's work, and then there's recreation, and we some people say that Americans worship their work and I forget that's but we're so committed to those two things, our work and our recreation, that the Lord's work just kind of gets, it's down there on the basement level. We never quite get around to it. And so this sort of Christianity, it says that these weeds, these things just choke the word out. They just take so much of our time, energy, and attention that after a while there's nothing left. And then there's the seed that prepares good fruit. Okay, so he gives this he actually gives a title. He calls it the parable of the sower. Some people said we should call it the parable of the soils, but anyway, Jesus says in verse 18, listen to what the parable of the sower means, and he gives the interpretation I just gave you. But in between the telling of the parable, its interpretation, we have verses 10 through 17. So I want to read that to you now because I think this is really pithy. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, now you'd think he would say, because it captures their attention. Nobody likes to hear theology all the time. They want to hear a story. So I tell these stories to hold their attention and to stick in their mind. That's not what he said at all. He said, because this knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And this is why I speak to them in parables. And then he quotes from the Old Testament. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So here it seems to be the ultimate expression of unfairness. You know, the person that's got gets more. The person that doesn't have much, he loses what he's got. And then he says, you know, the whole idea here is to make it hard for people to understand so they can't be saved. It's just people that have, bad hearing and don't see very well, which is me, they're not going to get it. They're not going to get it. He says their heart has become calloused. And I think that's a real key to understanding the whole passage. In fact, this is drawn from Isaiah chapter 6, which is an interesting thing because we go through 5 chapters of Isaiah and then we get the big commission scene. So Isaiah sees this vision of God on his throne in heaven, high and lifted up. And he hears the angels singing, holy, holy, holy. And immediately he's terrified. He said, because I'm an unclean man. I live among unclean people. And he says one of the angels came and took a hot coal from the altar and touched it against his lips, which makes me, I can feel the pain every time I read that. He says, now you're purified. And then God said, who will go and take our message? And I said, here am I. Isaiah said, here am I, send me. And so this is great. Isaiah has been, he's been sanctified and consecrated and purified. And he's ready to take the message. And God said, here's your mission. You go and proclaim the message to the people because they're not going to get it. And the more you proclaim, the less interested they're going to be. Boy, isn't that depressing? He says these people will be ever hearing but never understanding. And otherwise, he said, they could turn and I would heal them. Is God really being, is he really just rubbing his hands together that these people are going to get it? Or is he speaking out of more a sense of sorrow? Is he holding out his hands and saying, oh, if you only would listen? Is that it? And I kind of feel like it's the latter. But this whole chapter 13, all these parables and these secrets about the kingdom tell us something very important about following Jesus. So we're going to return to that at the end of our time together. But just got to keep that in mind. What is this business about parables and secrecy and all this? What does it say to us about the nature of following Jesus, the nature of his kingdom. Okay, so we have the parable of the sower, and then the commentary on why do you speak in parables, and then Jesus says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means, and he explains all about it. And then we get down to verse 24. It says, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Now, in working with parables, Jesus' parables, and there are about 27 of them, depending on how you count. Some of them are quite similar to each other, but one of the key principles is to look for a main point, one or two main ideas, main points. People, I think, have done great violence to the parables through the years in trying to turn them into allegories, where every little detail is supposed to have some important meaning. However, when Jesus gives us the meaning of this parable, he does turn it into more or less an allegory. He gives you matching realities to most of the details in the story. He gives us the meaning of this parable, again, a little bit further down. There's another block of parables. And then we get, in verse 36, the explanation of the parable of the weeds. And this, again, has a title in the text, the parable of the weeds of the field. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So almost all these parables in chapter 13 deal with the kingdom. And I've mentioned before that the true meaning of the kingdom of heaven in the gospel is a little bit elusive. About the time you think you've really got your hands on it, you really understand it, you really mastered this concept, then something else arises. Jesus inserts something else, some other property of the kingdom, and you have trouble reconciling that with everything else. And so it is here. Because we've talked about the kingdom is more about God's rule than about a realm. It's more about submitted hearts and Jesus' control, God's control over people's hearts, than it is about geography. But here we find good and bad mixed together in the kingdom. It says that they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. Things that cause sin and all who do evil, what are they doing in the kingdom? And so Jesus says, at least during this era that we're in, our time on earth, we're going to find good people, children of the kingdom, living for him, growing side by side with weeds, the weeds representing the people who have allegiance to Satan, the people of the evil one, as he points it here. So, if we are listening to Jesus, we should never be too surprised or even dismayed when we find wickedness among our brothers and sisters in the church, in the kingdom. It's going to happen. There's going to be a mixture of good and bad, and we should always have our eyes open. It doesn't mean that we're quick to label people as being either good guys or bad guys. We are commanded to try to bring back those who are erring, bring back those who are sinful, to forgive one another 77 times. At the same time, there's going to be weeds among the wheat. And there is a place, I think, for church discipline, and that is covered in Matthew 18 and other places in the Bible. But if we set ourselves the task of weeding the kingdom in this life, then we will do great violence to that kingdom. And so the master tells the servants, let it grow. When it comes time to harvest, we'll separate things out then. And there's another important point about the kingdom that's made here that we should not overlook, and it occurs again and again in Jesus' parables and his teaching, and that is there ultimately will be an accounting. There is a judgment day coming. And we have to put this together with what the rest of the New Testament teaches about grace and our being saved by grace, not by works. At the same time, we would be ignoring a good bit of what Jesus is teaching if we said, whether or not we have faith, whether or not we have love, whether or not we are committed to Him makes no difference at all, because clearly it does make a difference in the final accounting, in reward and punishment. In fact, there is an ultimate reckoning. So here we have in chapter 13 a set of parables that are designed to teach us something about the kingdom. And every parable, I think, if we read it with an open heart and an open mind, causes us to do some self-examination, some reflection. For example, we might ask ourselves today, not last week, not next year, but just today, what kind of soil am I? What is my behavior indicating about the condition of my heart and how I'm responding to the seed, to God's message? We could say, am I really one of the disciples, or am I with the people? Am I willing to seek Jesus out and ask Him questions and try to go deeper in my understanding and appreciation of what it means to be His follower, or am I more casual? One thing I think that these parables emphasize is that Christianity, following Jesus, is not designed to be casual or convenient. The bar is set pretty high here to reward those who push for something deeper, something more. And trying to reconcile this, and I've already mentioned, trying to reconcile this emphasis on secrecy, on selectivity, with the open invitation, with the proclamation we read about in other places in the book of Matthew. And by the way, if you print out the handout that came to you with the email about this class, there's actually a hyperlink to these verses, 6 verses in the book of Matthew that talk about proclamation of the kingdom. But reconciling these two things, I was trying to think about something that is analogous in our world. And about the time that I was 19, 20 years old, maybe a little bit older than that, it's been a long time ago as a point here, a great change came about in our country. We went from having a military where young men were drafted, that is, they were compelled by the government to serve in the military for a certain period of time, to going to what we call an all-volunteer force. And so the military now seeks men and women, usually young men and young women, who are wanting to serve. They're wanting to use this as a career or to start a career. And it's all about volunteers. And so we see a lot more advertising. It used to be the military didn't advertise because, they weren't really looking for people. They weren't trying to recruit people so much. They could just draft people. There was a little bit of advertising, but not so much. But now it's everywhere. And so there's all sorts of slogans. In particular, I think about the Marines. And one of the slogans for the Marines is the few, the proud, the Marines, or the Marines are just looking for a few good men. These slogans that come across. So they are broadcast. They are disseminated far and wide through radio, television, social media, ads in the background at sporting events, and so forth and so on. So the message goes out to everybody, but they're not trying to recruit everybody. Because when a young person goes down to the recruiting office and tells them that he wants to become a Marine, then the recruiter begins to find out if they're really qualified. Have they completed high school? How did they do in school? Have they been to junior college? What's their physical situation? Are they physically fit? Are they healthy? Do they have any psychological problems? And so forth and so on. And so they have to pass a lot of the bar to get in is really high. And then once they're in, completing the training is very, very difficult. And I have some friends, younger people, that have gone through some of this training. I'm really proud of them because I know it's not easy to get through. It's not easy to get through. And so the invitation goes out to everybody, but people self-select based upon their goals, their motivation, and so forth. And so that I think is a key to understanding Jesus' approach to discipleship. In the end, it's not for everybody. It's for those who really, really, really want that deep relationship with him. Well, at any rate, next time, I hope we can continue, perhaps complete this chapter 13, Important Discourse of Jesus about the Kingdom. And I'm hoping that very soon, and I want you to stay tuned for information about this, we'll resume meeting our class in person at the Oxford Church of Christ at 9 a.m. on Sundays. Till then, please pray for me as I pray for you.